For years, rumours persisted that amongst the collection of the University of Strasbourg were body parts from Jewish victims of the Nazis, some still in jars labelled Jew.
Not even in the most twisted fantasies of Dr. Frankenstein were the levels of sadism and dehumanization reached as in the experiments conducted in Nazi concentration camps. Jewish and Romani prisoners were systematically subjected to a battery of medical and genetic tests and trials, whose sole purpose was to use them as test animals to pursue a superior race. In today's video, we will focus on the most atrocious experiments and who the perverse ideologists behind these practices, now considered crimes against humanity, were. If you are sensitive, we recommend caution on this journey to the Nazi past in a new installment of military history. The victims of these Nazi experiments were mostly Jews from all over Europe, although also Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and disabled Germans. These groups were forced to participate without any kind of consent. Generally, the experiments resulted in the death, disfigurement, or permanent disability of the patients, which is why they are seen as examples of medical torture. These atrocities were carried out in the various concentration camps that the Third Reich had throughout the Second World War. One of the main testing sites was Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. There and in other camps, inmates were selected to be subjects of study for sinister experiments aimed at aiding German military personnel in combat, the recovery of wounded military personnel, and the promotion of the racial ideology of the Third Reich. Other tests included attempts to cure homosexuality, for example. The Nazis were in a positivist and scientific development and had millions of people they considered inferior to freely experiment with their bodies, violating medical ethics without scruples. The SS doctors assigned to concentration camps played a special role as they were responsible for overseeing the activities of the intern doctors who had been forced to work in the camp's medical service. Many of these doctors were Jews and were forced to intervene brutally and savagely on patients of their own background. Just to give an example, between 1942 and 1943, various tests were carried out in the Ravensbrück concentration camp to study bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration. One of these activities involved bone transplantation, which was carried out in inhuman ways to observe the patient's reactions. Sections of bones, muscles, and nerves were extracted without anesthesia, resulting in many victims experiencing intense agony, mutilation, or permanent disability. Let's examine a testimony of a mild yet terrible case during the Nuremberg trial. The audio of the original material is slightly damaged, but it is understood that the woman on the stand cannot move one of her feet, and that a large portion of muscle from her calf was removed, mutilating her forever.
Like this. Up. Now try to do it here. Yes. Dorsiflexion is completely gone.
One of the first atrocities carried out by the Nazis in the camps had a corporate tint. Between 1941 and 1944, SS camp doctors Friedrich Entress, Helmuth Feder, and Eduard Wirtz conducted clinical trials on the tolerance and effectiveness of new drugs and medications. Such risky tests are usually performed under the strictest care and precautions. However, during the height of the Third Reich, e.g. Farbenindustrie, the pharmaceutical conglomerate of the Führer, particularly Bayer, used human guinea pigs to test their products. These trial medications were administered to prisoners suffering from contagious diseases, many of whom had been deliberately infected by SS doctors to test vaccines. But the Nazis weren't solely driven by corporate interests. In 1942, Professor August Hirt, head of the anatomy department at the Reich University in Strasbourg, set out to assemble a collection of Jewish skeletons under the auspices of the Ahnenerbe Foundation. It's as sinister as it sounds. The Nazi madness aimed to understand anthropologically those they considered inferior beings. Hirt received permission from Himmler to select a necessary and varied number of prisoners in the Auschwitz concentration camp. According to official records, the selection of 115 individuals comprised 79 Jewish men, 30 Jewish women, 2 Poles, and 4 Asians, probably Soviet prisoners of war. The preliminary preparation involved biometric measurements and the collection of personal data so that each skeleton would have a clinical history. Once the data collection was completed, the chosen ones were mercilessly sent to the extermination sites where they were killed in the gas chamber. The victims' corpses were sent to Hirt as material for his skeleton collection, intended for use in anthropological studies demonstrating the superiority of the Nordic race. There, they would be embalmed and analyzed, as recorded by the Nazi scientist himself in one of his reports. They were given a false physical examination to reassure them, and then they were gassed. The corpses were immediately transported to the anatomy pavilion of the University Hospital of Strasbourg. A French embalmer, who had to assist the project director, recounted how preservation began immediately, with the arrival of bodies still warm, with very open and bright eyes. Due to the Nazis' defeat, Hirt's sinister work remained unfinished, and like all Nazis with their atrocities, this doctor attempted to erase the traces of his research to avoid being judged. He discarded many of the skeletons and dissected bodies, but mainly cut and burned their heads to prevent any possibility of identification. While some tried to empirically prove the existence of the Aryan race, others tried to expand it directly, convinced of its supremacy. Karl Klauberg experimented with sterilization systems on the female population of the Auschwitz camp. This depraved Nazi scientist developed a method of non-surgical mass sterilization involving the introduction of a specially prepared chemical irritant into the female reproductive organs to produce severe inflammation. Thousands of Jewish and Romani women were subjected to this treatment, involving multiple local injections, causing them terrible pains, inflamed ovaries, stomach spasms, and bleeding. The interventions severely damaged the victims' ovaries, which were then removed and sent to Berlin for examination. After several weeks, the fallopian tubes would close and block due to inflammation. Klauberg's experiments killed some of his patients, and others were executed to allow for autopsies.
These young people served the fascist doctors as research material in causing sterility. This young woman was subjected to injections of poisonous substances.
Let's remember that the idea behind making inferior women infertile was to populate the world with the Aryan race and to ensure the extinction of Jews and Roma. Another professional who followed this line was Dr. Horst Schumann. Like his colleague, Schumann sought a practical means of mass sterilization that would allow the Third Reich to carry out the biological destruction of conquered nations through scientific methods by depriving people of their reproductive capacity. In one of the barracks at Birkenau, a sterilization by X-rays apparatus was installed for this doctor. Daily, several dozen Jewish prisoners, both men and women, were subjected to sterilization experiments involving exposing women's ovaries and men's testicles to X-rays. Various intensities of rays were applied at different intervals, seeking the precise dose of the procedure to achieve infertility. Radiation exposure caused severe burns on the subject's abdomen, groin, and buttocks, resulting in suppurating sores that became infected and ultimately killed them. The results of the X-ray sterilization experiments were not satisfactory. In an article he sent to Himmler in April 1944, Schumann expressed his preference for surgical castration as it was faster and safer. These experiments make it clear that Jews and Roma were treated as mere test animals, nothing more, nothing less. However, the Nazis' ambitions would grow darker when they began to fantasize about genetic studies of prisoners. Not only were millions of people systematically murdered in concentration camps, but they were also subjected to ruthless research regarding genes and human capabilities. For example, Dr. Johann Paul Kremer conducted an experiment in Auschwitz on the changes that occur in the human body as a result of extreme hunger, particularly liver atrophy. Many of them were on the verge of exhaustion, in the final stages of starvation unto death while being studied. When they reached that state, most of them were ordered to be killed by phenol injection. However, there was a practice carried out by Kremer himself that was truly gruesome. He selected prisoners whom he found particularly interesting as experimental material, and just before their death, while lying on the autopsy table awaiting the injection, He questioned them about personal data such as their weight before arrest and the medications they had used, lifestyle habits, among others. Kramer said he was interested in the changes that occur in the human body as a result of hunger, in an attempt to find some kind of medication to alleviate that suffering in German men. Now let's see how during the Nuremberg trials, Nazi doctors were accused of conducting wild tests to see how the human body behaved in a fall from an airplane.
The report describes the victim's reactions: spasmodic convulsions, agonal convulsive breathing, chronic convulsions and groaning. He yells aloud, convulses arms and legs, grimaces, bites his tongue, does not respond to speech, gives the impression of someone who is completely out of his mind. The evidence which we will produce will establish that the defendants Rupp and Romberg personally participated with Rasher in experiments resulting in death and torture.
Among other genetic studies to achieve Aryan race superiority, and above all to cure and heal wounded Nazi soldiers during the Second World War, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's personal physician, would commit true atrocities. Along with his assistants, Fritz Fischer and Ludwig Stumpfegger, they began to conduct experiments on young and healthy prisoners of questionable scientific validity. Their tasks resembled more of a slaughterhouse than a medical office, as they amputated limbs of camp inhabitants wholesale and then tested various orthopedic prostheses. These monstrosities occurred mainly in Ravensbrück, where Gebhardt conducted sinister medical experiments involving amputations, defenestrations, exchange of amputated limbs, re-implants of arms or legs between prisoners, dissections of living and unanesthetized people, and experiments with antibiotics. Believing that he justified his actions by stating that he was carrying out these trials to save German soldiers, he simulated war wounds in prisoners, whether by introducing splinters of wood, metal shards, dirt, glass, or foreign bodies infected with various streptococci to provoke gas gangrene and tetanus. The idea was to injure Jews and Roma for further study. The experiments were followed by the observation of control subjects, that is, without treatment, to assess the effects of the experience. Most prisoners died due to infections and trial conditions, while others who showed some improvement were gassed once they were finished being examined. While everything we've just heard is as terrible as it is unbelievable, there is one name that has gone down in history as the most twisted of all. We are talking about Josef Mengele, who was considered a genius by the Nazis, extremely respected in academic circles, and a fundamental part of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Genetics, and Eugenics. He was basically drawn to any genetic malformation or anomaly in humans, as he aimed to prevent errors in the Aryan race and try to foster what he considered genetically beneficial traits. Mengele's first experimental subjects were Romani children. Those suffering from noma, a gangrenous bacterial disease of the mouth and face characteristic of the Romani ethnicity, were executed by the Nazis' orders to conduct pathological research on their corpses. Sinisterly, he commanded to preserve their small organs and even the complete heads of the children, which were sent in jars to institutions like the Academy of Medicine in Graz, Austria, for analysis. The scientist also began selecting dwarfs and individuals with physical peculiarities, including congenital disabilities and developmental defects that occur in dwarfism, from transports carrying Jews to the camps. Mengele's research subjects were better fed and housed than other prisoners, temporarily safe from execution in the gas chambers. When visiting his young subjects, he presented himself as Uncle Mengele and offered them sweets, making the relationship even more twisted. In 1941, Mengele led a series of experiments to try to discover how to treat hypothermia. One study forced subjects to endure in a tank of icy water for at least 3 hours. In another case, he placed naked prisoners outdoors in sub-zero temperatures for several hours. In addition to studying their physical effects, the experimenters tried to devise different ways to rewarm the survivors once they had undergone the trauma. Here we see the results on the bodies of some Jewish children.
Children had frost-bitten feet. The Germans had been leaving them for 12 hours in the frost.
The method of experimentation was torturous. Selections focused on young and healthy Jews who were stripped and prepared for the trial. An isolated probe measuring the drop in body temperature was inserted into the rectum and held in place by an expandable metal ring that was adjusted to open inside the rectum and hold it firmly in place. The victim was dressed in a German Air Force uniform and then placed in the cold water tub to begin the freezing process. The studies revealed that most lost consciousness halfway through the process and died when their body temperature dropped to 25 degrees C. The bodies were studied and discarded, and then another test subject was used. Mengele took advantage of Auschwitz as an opportunity to continue his anthropological studies and research on heredity, his great fascination. As noted, his medical procedures showed no consideration for the health, safety, or physical and emotional suffering of the victims. He was particularly obsessed with identical twins, people with heterochromia iridum, the characteristic of having eyes of two different colors, as well as people with physical anomalies and dwarfism. Mengele's less invasive experiments included attempts to change the iris color by injecting chemicals into the eyes of living subjects, even attempting eye transplants. When that failed, he killed people with heterochromatic eyes so he could remove them and send them to Berlin for study. His experiments with dwarfs and deformed people included taking physical measurements and extracting blood, teeth, and skin. He also treated them with trial medications and unnecessary X-rays. Many of his victims were sent to the gas chambers after a few weeks of experimentation, but their skeletons were recovered and sent to the German capital for further analysis. Mengele also sought out pregnant women with whom he conducted experiments before sending them to the gas chambers. One survivor claims to have witnessed how the sinister Nazi doctor performed anesthesia-free vivisection, extracting hearts and stomachs from the victims to see and understand the behavior of the organs and the dying patients. Patients who survived these savage interventions were forced back into forced labor until their demise. In the first phase of his experiments with his fetish element, Mengele subjected pairs of twins and people with physical disabilities to special medical examinations. Generally painful and exhausting, these examinations lasted for hours and were a difficult experience for patients, as most were hungry and terrified children, because Mengele's twisted mind preferred to experiment on young subjects to understand their development. Subjects were photographed, plaster molds of their teeth and jaws were made, and their fingerprints and footprints were taken. As soon as the examinations ended, Mengele ordered twins, dwarfs, and deformities to be killed by a phenol injection so he could move on to the next phase of his experiments, the comparative analysis of internal organs during autopsy. From 1944 onwards, twins were selected and placed in special barracks. Auschwitz provided Mengele with a large number of specimens to study. Some of those selected, like Irene and Rene Gutmann, were already in the camp. Let's listen to their testimony.
When I got to the infirmary, what I remember is I always had to get undressed and being put between two cold plates, which I know were called Röntgen machines. I think that's X-ray. And measured and weighed and poked and pushed.
I remember going to Mengele specifically, have recollections of blood being taken from my neck and my arms. I hate doctors.
Mengele's twin research aimed in part to demonstrate the supremacy of heredity over the environment, and thus strengthen the Nazi premise of the genetic superiority of the Aryan race. According to the Nazi, twins provided the perfect experimental specimens, as one could serve as a control while the other endured the experiments. Studies on twins were also motivated by the intention of increasing the reproduction rate of the German race by improving the chances of racially desirable people having twins. Already in an unsustainable spiral of madness, a witness described how Mengele sewed two Romani twins back-to-back in a savage attempt to create Siamese twins, causing both children to die of gangrene after several days of suffering. Given the criminality of all cases, these actions were judged in what became known as the doctor's trial. Rejection of the abuses perpetrated led to the development of the Nuremberg Code on medical ethics. Of the over 3,000 children involved in Mengele's experiments, barely around 200 survived. They now reside around the world, and those still alive seek information about what was done to them. Their files have never been located, and the experiments they were subjected to remain a mystery. These barbaric atrocities are just another example of what Nazism was capable of in its attempt to confirm and perpetrate the dominance of the Aryan race on the planet. In this way, we are reaching today's shocking video. We thank you for making it to the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the next installments of Military History.